gang. Here's to nights that turn into mornings and friends that turn into family. Cheers!
Hello, and welcome to the Friendship IRL podcast. I'm your host, Alex Alexander. My friends, they would tell you I like to ask the hard questions. You know who I am in the group. I'm the person that's saying, okay, I'm going to ask this question, but don't feel like you have to answer it. And now I can be that friend for you too. If you are here listening to the Friendship IRL podcast, hanging out with me, then I think it's pretty safe to assume that you are doing the work when it comes to friendship and community. You're making the changes, you're putting in the effort, you have decided that these connections are important. I want to commend you for that. I want to say, good freaking job, because as you're going to hear in today's episode, this is an important part, but so many of you come to me and you want to take it a step further. People message me and they say things like, how do I help my kids with friendship? How do I break this pattern? How do I set them up for success? And I've always kind of shared the same message, which is put on your oxygen mask first. So many of us as adults are struggling with friendship and community and connection because it wasn't modeled. So part of breaking the cycle is modeling friendship. And I still firmly believe that the put your own oxygen mask on first is one of the most important things you can do. In fact, you'll hear today's guest, Pam, also talking about how important modeling is. But if you want to take this a step further when it comes to helping your kids make and maintain friendships and learn the skills necessary that they can take with them into the rest of their life, then today's episode is for you. Let me tell you a little bit about our guest today. Pam Howard is a licensed clinical social worker. She's a former K-8 school counselor, and she is also a master life coach for high-achieving moms. I have to tell you right now that Pam also is the host of a podcast called Less Drama, More Mama. And at the time I am recording this intro, it has nearly 300 episodes, jam-packed with information for anybody out there who is navigating parenting. You'll also hear Pam mention this in the episode, but Pam is the mom of 2 teenage daughters. And when Pam reached out to me and said, hey, I think I could come on and help your audience when it comes to parenting and navigating, teaching our kids friendship skills, I was like, yes, because she has helped so many kids do this firsthand in the school system, which is currently where a lot of kids are learning these skills. Not to mention that she is also working with so many parents through her work now and her podcast. Today, we are going to talk about how you can take all this friendship talk and bring it into your home, into your dining table, into your car conversations. You can make it a new family norm, that there are just these small little check-ins and conversations that you're having with your kids about navigating friendship. Our goal here is to set the next generation up for friendship success. So with that, let's get to today's episode. Hi, Pam. I'm so excited that you're here today.
Hi, Alex. I'm excited to be here.
Against all odds, even though we've both had a little bit of a day today, we are here. And I'm really excited about this conversation because this is a conversation that, gosh, so many people want to talk about, which is how are we helping our kids make friends? So many people. And quite often my answer to that is, I think we need to focus on ourselves a little bit first, like put your own oxygen mask on. But I am sure so many people care deeply now that they're realizing the importance of friendship about trying to do everything they can for their kids. So I'm really happy that you're here today to talk about it because I know people are going to listen to this episode. They're going to be really excited for it. Can you tell us a little bit about you and your background and your experiences?
Yeah, sure.
Why you're here today talking about kids and friendship?
So I am a mom myself. I have 2 kids that are 14 and almost 18. I am a social worker and have always worked with kids and families, and then became a school counselor. I was a school counselor for 6 years and worked with kids in kindergarten through 8th grade. And now I'm a life coach for moms. And so my whole life is centered around kids and moms and families. And when you approached me about coming on your podcast to talk about friendships, there were obviously a lot of different topics that I could talk about with relation to that in terms of moms making new friends and things like that. But I think it's a really worthwhile topic to talk about kids and friendships, and as parents, how to help our kids navigate those.
Yeah, like I said before, I know for a fact that a lot of people, well, okay, how do I want to put this? I think that a lot of people, like, we just assume that kids have friends.
Right.
Or they don't. And then that's very upsetting.
Mm-hmm.
But there's not a lot of action necessarily that comes with that quite often.
Yeah.
And if I really think about friendship and being a kid, so much of friendship is just kind of assumed. It's like proximity. You go to school or soccer practice or whatever, and you meet your friends there. And that's about it.
Mm-hmm.
And there's also just not a lot of, not everyone, but for a lot of people, there's not a lot of intention there. It's kind of like we're supposed to prioritize friendship as a kid. That's normal. But then, it's like, oh, they're just their little friends. And there's kind of almost a minimizing about how important kids' friends are at the same time. I am jumping in a little early here, but I just threw out something casually like, hey, yeah, we're minimizing how important our kids' friendships are. And some of you might have just been like, what? That's fair. So I want to expand. Overall, I think that the general sentiment is that friendships are important for kids. They need to learn these skills that they will carry on into the rest of their lives. I mean, that is why we are doing this whole episode. But I am incredibly tuned in to the frequency of friendship. And by that, I mean, anytime I hear anybody talking about this stuff in my general vicinity, it's like my ears perk up. I mean, shoot, I was in a coffee shop yesterday, waiting for a cup of coffee, listening to these 3 older men talk about how long it had been since they seen each other and their friendships. And like, I hear it all. And so because I am so tuned in, I think that we have a mismatch going on that a lot of people don't realize. On one hand, we will talk about how important friendship is for kids. And then we will slip in these little phrases that just don't align. They don't support what we actually think. So let me give you an example. Let's say that you have an elementary school kid and they want to set up some hangouts with their friends, some play dates. And it's been pretty hard to do that, to coordinate with the other parents. And I will hear people sometimes say to me a comment that is like, well, it's not like they're going to be friends with these kids when they're 40. And it always makes me stop in my tracks a little bit, be like, wait, so you're saying that this is important, but then we're saying that just because they're friends in elementary school and they may not make it to friendship at 40, these don't matter? Like, this is an opportunity to teach your kids a skill when it comes to friendship and the work it takes to set up play dates. This is an opportunity to show them that these connections are valuable. Also, this is an opportunity to remember that our friendships don't need to span 35 years to be valuable, but we'll say these little things kind of just as like well, moving on. Instead of, you could just say like, this is a lot of work and I don't have capacity for it. That's better. Honestly, I would appreciate that more. At least we're acknowledging what's really happening here. I want to give you another example. sometimes, this is an actual example I've heard recently, where there is a high school kid and one of their closest friends, the family is moving across the country. So this kid is heartbroken, understandably, because your friends are kind of your whole world in high school. They are heartbroken that their friend is moving away. And I've heard parents say, well, you're going to go to college in a few years and make a whole new set of friends, so it doesn't really matter. When this is such an opportunity to teach your kids the skills necessary to maintain long distance friendships. So when I'm talking about this minimizing, that's what I mean. On the whole, I think we agree that kids' friendships are important, but I don't think a lot of us realize these little phrases we're saying that are impacting the way we're approaching our friendships. Like those little phrases add up and they change how we act. Our words matter. A little later in the episode, you're going to hear Pam talk about how one of the most important things we can all do as adults, parents, but really all adults, is examine our friendship beliefs, because so much of our friendship beliefs are going to impact our kids' friendships. And I think that examining our friendship beliefs will also help us clear up these little statements. And if it doesn't, maybe now that I have pointed out these happening, you will also be tuned in to the friendship radio frequency and you might start hearing these. And maybe you'll see what I'm saying.
Well, as a school counselor, I mean, I'm just remembering back to when I was at the school, and it was most of the issues that kids came to me about were friendship struggles, right? And this one said this and this one did that. And they would come to me to help them try to figure out what to do in those situations. And then also a lot of parents would call and say, my kid is being left out, or my kid is, doesn't have friends. What can I do? How can I help? And especially as kids get older into middle school and high school, I mean, their peers become like their world. And so those relationships are so important and are going to influence our kids in so many ways.
Yeah, I think that, you were saying you have a 14 and an 18-year-old. Like you've seen the whole spectrum now of their like school friends, and you're setting up play dates, and then they can kind of start doing that stuff on their own. And then they get licenses and cars and freedom. And then like a lot of their free time and activities and interests center around their friends.
Yes. And, my kids are very different. So I was going to mention this, like some kids find it really easy to make friends. Like my older daughter, she's super extroverted. She's, has several friends. She loves just going up and talking to people and meeting new people. But for my younger daughter, she's the opposite. She's very introverted, and it takes her a while to warm up to people. And she has, one or two very, very close friends, but that's about it, which is great for her.
Yep.
That's, she's okay with that. I mean, studies have shown that even having one friend significantly improves a child's emotional health and school performance. And so not everybody is the same when it comes to making friends or how many they have. And then there's a huge population of kids that are on the autism spectrum and have real challenges with reading social cues and knowing how to relate to other people. So there's that whole thing too.
We talk about this a lot on the podcast, which is that there's a lot of societal narratives that tell us that there's like a right way to have friends, like you should have that big group of friends, or you should have that one best friend. And like you were saying, everybody's different. What might feel good to one person may feel terrible to someone else. Like they may hate a big group of friends. And so not trying to force anything, but instead with yourself, but also with your kids, just like remaining curious and mostly be like, do you have what you want? Does it feel good right now in your friendships? Because if not, then that's a place for like reflection and conversation and energy and effort. If it feels good, then okay, let me know if that changes, I think, for adults and for kids.
Yeah. I think it's really important am I talking mostly to moms or moms and dads?
Oh, this podcast has a
Everybody?
very broad, yeah.
Okay. So anyone who deals with
Yeah.
kids, right? Anyone with kids in their lives, I think it's important for us to take a look at our own experiences with friends because we often project our own experiences or our fears and insecurities onto our kids. And so becoming aware of those can help us separate out our experience from their experience. So, for example, if you're the type of person who loves big crowds, right, then you're trying to like encourage your kids to go to parties and things like that, which may not be their scene. It may be too overwhelming and they don't enjoy it at all. Or if you felt like you were left out a lot at school with friends, like you may be hyper focused on making sure your kids never feel that way. And so when you operate out of fear like that, you tend to interfere more with whatever is going on with your kids and make it harder for them to figure out their relationships on their own. So it's really important before you do anything is to just kind of reflect on what your experience was with your friendships at their ages and know, okay, that was how I experienced this. That doesn't mean that it's going to be the same for them. And how can I try to have like an open mind and curious, like you said before, a curious mind about what they're going through and how it could be a totally different experience.
Do any stories that people might have come to mind, like examples? Because I have some, but maybe you have some too. Like, for example, that like everybody needs one best friend.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think the thing that I hear the most from moms is just, I want them to have friends. I want them to be happy. I want them to, and it all comes back to when we explore it more, it comes back to whatever they had experienced growing up and in their childhood, like whatever their fear is for their child, it's based on what they went through. And so we have to do some work to like untangle that.
Yeah. I've heard some pretty wild.
But what's your story?
Oh, no, I've heard so many. Like I had somebody tell me one time that they had a very, very young kiddo, like in preschool, and they were nervous preschool age. They were nervous to send their kid to preschool because they had been bullied as a kid and they didn't want their kid to be bullied. So they didn't even want to put them in preschool. Right? Like that's a pretty wild fear somebody has. I've heard younger people who are just outside that high school age, like freshmen in college and things like that. There's a lot of that. I don't even know how to put this. Like your high school friends, you're going to outgrow them. You're going to leave them behind. You're never going to see them again. You'll make new friends in college. They aren't that important. And again, like just because your experience was that you don't keep in touch with your high school friends, that doesn't mean somebody won't. Now they may not. They might. Like it doesn't matter. There's not like a good or a bad there.
Yeah.
But we push all these things. Somebody else, there was a father who told his son that, you know, like this is the time in life in high school to go to every sports thing, every party, every whatever, because basically when you get older, you won't have friends anymore. Like we're all
your social life will be dead.
All these things all the time, which is what I mean about, you know, it's kind of like that societal story. Like you become an adult, you lose all your friends. It doesn't have to be that way.
Yeah.
And yet we're just throwing these buzz phrases around and like normalizing it. And there is no normal. It's just like whatever feels right to you is right to you, whether that looks completely different than everybody else. It doesn't matter.
Yeah. I think this is also making me think about like how important it is to model for our kids what friendship looks like. You want to make sure that you are showing your kids what healthy, respectful, mutual friendship looks like as adults. And even, I would say, talking about when things aren't going great in a friendship, to even like show your kids how you deal with that, hopefully in a mature and loving way. But, not everything is going to always be sunshine and roses in friendships.
Yeah.
So that's important too.
I mean, they say that thing, right, where if you like married parents, well, anybody really, that your kids should see you fight sometimes, not in a blowout way, like in a constructive way, because a lot of times all kids see is the disagreement and then the resolution, and they don't see the process. I think that's similar with friends. That's exactly what you're saying, is sometimes letting them see that you were hurt by a friend and you had to have a conversation with them. And this is the kind of thing you said, and now you're going to work through it. I think that's, I say all the time when people ask me about how to help their kids have friends, that one of the main things is to model it. And I don't even think that means, when I say that, it doesn't, like you were saying, it doesn't even mean, again, like build that big friend group or find that one friend. Like modeling it can just be deciding that this is an important area of life to invest your energy and discussing it as a family. So an example of that is, I have a listener who told me that her family realized that dad had no friends. And as a family, they decided that this is the year dad is going to make some friends. And they talk about it. They talk about friendship.
Was dad on board?
Yeah. Dad was on board. Like,
okay,
he was all in. Yeah. It wasn't a bad thing. It was just kind of like, this hadn't been a priority. He was working all the time, raising little kids, like other things had taken a priority. This had kind of slipped away, and their kids are a little older now, like realized that dad deserves some people to go have fun with too. And so they would talk about it at the dinner table. Sometimes they would talk about how, maybe this weekend, instead of going on a family hike, dad was going to go on a hike with some friends, because it's important that dad has friends. And this is the kind of thing you have to do, that, like dad's going to go on a trip. And that means that in this case, mom is being like the sole parent on a very busy week. And she's going to carry that load because it is important this week for like dad to make friends. And now it's like a very open conversation about how this is important, and like how they're making this a priority amongst all the other priorities, right?
Yeah, because it's so important as we get older to have friends and for our kids to see that. And it's like, one weekend, mom's going to go away with her friends, and another weekend, dad's going to go camping with his friends or whatever. It's so good. Yeah.
Yeah. And showing that like sometimes this is becoming the priority over something else this week. Not all the time, but like we are going to prioritize this amongst the rest of our life, I think is really helpful for kids to see. And then they can think about how they're doing that in their own life. One more example that I really love is, I have another friend who realized that for a lot of kids, parents are like the gatekeepers to friendship outside of school. They see their kids at school, but outside of school, it's whether the parent will drive you, whether they'll make time for that, how they'll prioritize their Saturday. So they kind of sat down and like had a conversation saying, hey, you are a young teen now. You need to start taking initiative to reach out to your friends and set up outside of school hangouts. We need to be communicating about which ones are your priorities so I can align my schedule accordingly, and kind of like teaching their kids that friendship requires work to maintain a friendship outside of just seeing your friends daily at school.
Yeah. I think that's so important for parents to hear too, is that seeing friends outside of school is so important. Oftentimes, like there's cliques or groups at school, and when you just get alone with one friend outside of school, the whole dynamic can change, and you can like deepen your friendship and get to know people on a different level, get to know them within the context of their family or at your house. And I love having play dates or hangouts now. My kids are older, right? At my house, because then I can sort of witness how my kids
Mhm.
interact with their friends and be witness to like who their friends are and hear the kinds of things that they talk about. And I just think that's important because then later I can have discussions with my kids about that. But it's also, I love when they go to their friends' houses and they can see like, well, this is how other people
Mhm.
live and this is what people eat and, all kinds of things. And they have pets and we don't. And it's just like broadening their horizon and broadening like their experiences in life.
I have this
So
phrase that our friends are windows into other ways to live. Like
yeah.
everything we see in our home growing up,
Mhm.
right? We just think is the way everybody lives. And then when you go to your
Yes.
friend's house, you
Right.
realize that your family sits at the dining room table and your friend's family sits at the counter, and neither one's bad.
Right.
It's kind of just a moment for your kids to be like, oh, which one do I
Mhm.
maybe want to do someday? Like that there are
Yeah.
options out
Yeah.
there. And I think that's really important.
I mean, I remember my family, we had lots of junk food, but my friend had different junk
Yep.
food. And it was like, oh, when I go to her house, I get to have, this Oreos or whatever it was, and that was like such a special treat to be able to do that.
Yep. Just like
I love that.
there's different options out there. We had talked a little bit about like skills that you need to teach your kids. Do you have any examples of
Mhm. Yeah.
skills maybe that you're thinking about with your kids or you've seen as a school counselor that kids could use help with?
Yes. So, I mean, as a school counselor, right, I used to go into the classrooms once a week or once every other week, and I would teach class and I would teach them all different kinds of skills. And the thing that's important to realize, we kind of touched on this earlier, is that kids aren't born knowing how to make friends or how to be friends, right? We have to teach them. And not every school has a counselor who goes in and teaches these things. But even if they do, being able to reinforce it at home and, have these discussions with your kids is important. So aside from modeling great friendships ourselves, we want to have conversations with our kids about why they think it's important to have friends. Number one, right? What it means to be a good friend, what qualities they look for in a friend, what qualities they themselves bring to a friendship. Like, what are their strengths? What are they particularly good at? We want to talk to them about, friends listen to one another and help each other. So we want to teach our kids how to listen well. Kids don't know how to listen well, right? They don't know. We need to like teach them and say, okay, like you can play games with your kids around this stuff if they're young, and just like, okay, I'm going to talk for 1 minute and you're going to just listen. Right. And then you'll tell me what you heard. And then we'll switch places and I'll talk. Was that right? No. And then you'll talk for a minute and I'll listen and just things like that. Or going out. This is something I used to do with the kindergartners, right? We would go on a walk and we would just sit and I would say, let's just listen to sounds in nature. And what do you hear? Right. And it was just like things like that. So listening skills, how to ask questions and show interest in other people, right? This was something that I used to tell a lot of my students, like they were so concerned about how other people saw them and being interesting. And I would say, spend less time trying to be interesting and more time being interested.
I love that.
When you have a conversation with somebody and they're like super into you and want to know all about you, it's the greatest feeling in the world. And they're like, you might not have said anything, but they'll walk away being like, oh, that Alex was so great. I love her because you just let them talk about themselves the whole time. So showing interest, empathy is a huge skill that needs to be taught to our kids, and, seeing things from other people's point of view. You can read books. You can watch shows or movies that lend themselves to conversations about these things. I just think it's so important. Empathy and compassion, that makes a good friend.
I think so much of this is just, again, like that curiosity piece, like having conversations about what happened with you and your friends today. Are you feeling good about your friendships? Like, oh, you got in a fight about this thing. Well, let's just try for a second to think about how they might be feeling? Or did you consider the fact that their family is about to move and maybe she's really nervous that she's going to lose you? Like, whatever the scenario is.
Right.
Like, I think so much of what you're saying sounds like it's just folding this in as a consistent topic of conversation that you're just like touching on all the time in small ways.
Yeah. Yeah. Because like we just assume that kids are going to learn how to figure it out. And we even tell kids, well, figure it out on your own. And that's like brings me to the next skill really is problem solving skills. This was huge in the school where I worked. Like the kids didn't know how to solve their own problems. So they were constantly going up to the teachers and tattling on each other or, complaining. And the teachers were like, I don't know what to do. So there's actually something called the Wheel of Choices that I love. You can Google it. You can find it
We'll
online.
Link it in
there's
the
like
show
several
notes.
different and there's several different versions of it, like some for younger kids, some for older kids. But basically, it's this wheel and it gives 9 different choices of what kids can do in a problematic situation. And one thing that I start by saying to the kids, we talk about what's the difference between a small problem and a big problem. And the way that I define it is a small problem is, those day-to-day things where you're feeling annoyed with somebody or you're feeling like left out or something, but it's something that doesn't require adult intervention. You can figure it out yourselves. And then a big problem is something that's maybe a safety concern or, something that does require an adult to come and help out. And so that way they have a better sense of like, okay, I know when to try to figure this out myself. And I know when I need to ask for help. This wheel of choices gives 9 different options. And so, for example, if your kid is on a play date and he and his friend each want to play a different game. I mean, this happens all the time, right? Like, I want to play this, but he wants to play that. And instead of like arguing with each other or running to you for help, they would know, okay, let's go to see what's on the wheel of choices, right? Okay, we can take turns. We can play rock, paper, scissors, or we can find a third alternative of a game to play, right? We have choices. We have options. They're feeling like empowered that they know how to solve their own problems. Or if a friend, says something unkind to your child, she'll know that she has a choice in how she responds to that. She can choose to ignore the comment and walk away. She can talk it out and express how she's feeling, or she can just make a request that the friend stop saying those types of things to her. So like, it's important, I think, to empower our kids with choices and know that they can solve problems because it's an inevitable part of being a friend, right?
Yeah. I mean, so much of friendship is obviously like managing differences. And adults have a hard time with that. I talk about that a lot on the podcast.
Yeah.
So then we add in, little kiddos trying to figure out things that adults are still trying to figure out. I mean, there might be some adults listening to this that are like, I'm going to hang the wheel of choices up for myself.
Yes, do.
And I think that's just such a great reminder to everybody listening that I think so much of friendship, because it's not something like it is a skill set, it's habits, and we're not really taught it very well. And we're not continually taught it. It's kind of like, oh, okay, here's kindergarten, age 5, you're good now. That it can't hurt any of us to check in on how we're problem solving in our friendships. Like, go back to the basics.
Yeah.
And think about how you're doing that as well as your kids. And then again, like, that's a great thing to model for your kids is saying like, oh, I had this disagreement with my friend. I'm going to pick this one off the wheel of choices.
Then I think another thing that's really important, and I think I was pretty good at this as a mom, not to say that I'm like an uncaring or unloving mother, but it's being okay with your kids' negative emotions. Because when they're navigating friendships, there's going to be drama, right? There's going to be friend drama, a lot of it. And like it used to be just like girl drama, but more and more, I think it's boys too having friend drama. So, they're going to feel disappointment, they're going to feel rejection and frustration and all that stuff. And it's like when we as parents get upset that they're upset, it doesn't help the situation. So if we can understand it's okay that our kids are having these maybe not so great experiences with friends, they're going to get through it and they're going to, each one can be just a learning experience. I think about it like dating, right? Like I was talking to a friend yesterday. She was telling me that she's dating like crazy, like going on tons and tons of dates. And she was saying she now knows what she wants in a relationship and what she doesn't and what she's looking for because of all these dates that she's had. And some have been okay, but some have really not been great. And it's the same with friendships too. It's like with each one, we're learning more and more about ourselves and about how we want to be treated and what we're looking for in our friends. So if we can keep that in our minds and know like sometimes it's not going to work out, but that's okay because it's building character and it's building experience for our kids that's going to be useful to them in the future. That's the way I look at it.
I mean, I think that's a great way to look at it. And I think it's just a great reminder too, so often one of those societal stories is kind of like friendship should always feel easy. It should always make us happy. It should always whatever. But, the truth of the matter is every relationship takes work. As we get older and we're more practiced, it's easier to do that work. But as kids, it's hard and it's messy and it's confusing. And also, I think for kids, the stakes feel high because their friends are very much a huge piece of their world at that point. And quite often, it seems sometimes like adults can minimize that for kids.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. I don't want parents to think that I'm saying, be happy or, uncaring about them having these feelings, but you still want to show up and it is a big deal to them and you want to validate that experience and validate their emotions. And you can be like empathetic about their experience, but not to, I guess, take it on as like a problem that needs to be fixed right away or, that something has gone wrong. It's just a normal part of being a kid.
Yeah. I mean, they're learning how to do the work and navigate friendships, and learning to do anything is hard. I mean, or not hard, like learning to do anything, learning to play a guitar. You mess up a million times. You pick back up your guitar. You try again. You try something new. You're frustrated. I think a lot of times we can jump to this like, well, your friends are bad. You have a hard time making friends. Like we can just kind of put these absolutes on it instead of just looking at it as neutral of you are doing the work to figure out how to navigate friendship. I just want to pop in here and tell you, yes, you, that you are doing the work to figure out how to navigate friendships. I know that this episode is meant for how do we help our kids. And I think that Pam is crushing it at that duty, at that job. But I also just listening to this, I'm thinking, oh my gosh, so many of us adults need this. We need to remember to go back, to sit around our dinner table by ourselves and just spend a few minutes reflecting on our friendships. To remember that we're not a bad friend. We're just figuring this out. To relearn that there's a wheel of choices. So again, you are doing a great job. You are putting in the work to build the connections you want. Don't forget that.
I'll give you an example of my own kids. My older daughter, like starting in probably the 5th or 6th grade, every year she would become really close with one person in particular. And then there would be another friend that would kind of join their group. And so it would become like a threesome. And then my daughter would somehow, she would feel excluded, but she wasn't being excluded, but she would exclude herself, right? Because she would think, oh, well, they want to be together more and they like each other more than they like me. And she had this whole story in her mind. So she would then like become withdrawn and not hang out with them as much. And then she would like lose that group of friends. And it happened like 3 years in a row with different people. And I watched it all happen. And I was there for her in terms of like, she was sad and upset about a lot of it. But I remember at one point saying to her, this is what I've noticed. And I explained to her what I was seeing, and not in a judgmental way, but just like, isn't this interesting? This seems to be a pattern. Like, let's look at it together. And then since then, she's really found a group of people where, she feels so comfortable and herself and not trying to compete with anybody. So yeah, it's just kind of as a mom observing a lot of what's going on without trying to interfere. But then at a certain point, you can kind of share what you're observing and make suggestions, but be okay if they don't want to hear it or want to take your suggestions. That's up to them ultimately.
I mean, all I could think about when you're telling that story is like how lucky your daughter is to have somebody who's paying attention and just like gently asking those questions to allow her to reflect. And, at the end of the day, you can't break that pattern for her, which I think is what you're trying to say. But she can now that she has a little more awareness that it's happening. And that's the beauty of the whole thing.
Yeah.
Because otherwise she might have kept repeating that pattern for a really long time and then continually being disappointed.
Yeah. And who knows, it may happen again someday in college or whatever, but we keep getting experiences until we learn the lesson we need to learn.
Yes. And we're all always learning. There's no, I think there is something to be said with friendship of like, nobody's an expert. It's always changing. Our life experience is always changing. Our situation's always changing. So like, we all just have to be okay with continually learning and checking in and reflecting and adjusting. There's no like perfect friend situation for any of us.
Yeah, true.
But now your daughters are lucky enough to know that they should be checking in because you're helping them do that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Pam, do you have any other final thoughts? Like, I know this episode, I'm positive that this episode, at this point, people are really reflecting on how they're approaching this. Do you have any final thoughts for anybody?
I think it kind of comes back to what I mentioned in the beginning. Like, your own mindset around this stuff is going to be the most important thing, and getting your thoughts and beliefs around friendship and what it should or shouldn't look like for your kids, that's going to be the most important work that you can do, because the way that you're going to show up for your kids is dependent on how you are in your own mind first. And so if you've got any negative associations with friendship or things like that, what I would say is like clean that up, so to speak, like get maybe some outside or objective help to figure out like how you can think about that in a way that serves you and your child, rather than kind of bringing that into the relationship and projecting that onto your kids.
And I think, if people are listening to this podcast, quite often they're trying to reflect on their own beliefs about friendship. So there are plenty of other resources, but I do think anybody who's here and listening to this podcast, that's one version of beginning to do the work you're talking about.
Yeah.
So for anybody that's feeling this overwhelming pressure that you need to completely overhaul all your friendship beliefs, like, let that go. You're probably doing a great job. Continue listening, continue seeking out other resources. It's like a slow and steady thing.
Yeah. And just become more curious and aware of what you're thinking. That's really the first step, is just thinking about what you're thinking about, right? If you notice that you are having like a pretty strong reaction to something that's going on with your kids and their friends, that you stop and like say, wait a minute, let's take a look at like, why am I having this strong reaction, what's coming up for me, and kind of deal with that before trying to intervene with your kids.
Pam, thank you so much for being here. We will tag and link and do all the things in the show notes. And I just want to suggest to any listeners that want to talk about this further, go find Pam, send her a DM.
Yeah.
Check out her work, because I think you have a lot of really great thoughts for people that have this concern. And I know there are a lot of people who have this concern. So I just really appreciate you taking the time and having this conversation.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. It was so fun. This is not a topic that I have really touched on much on my own podcast, but I'm like, I need to talk about this more. It was really good for me to think this through and have this conversation with you. So thank you.
Yes, you do. Okay, now go find her podcast, everyone. I'm just so appreciative of Pam for coming on here and tackling this conversation. It is such an important one. I know that this is a concern that a lot of you listening have, and I'm just really grateful to be able to put this episode out. The good news is Pam said that the most important thing you can do is check in on your own beliefs. And if you are listening to the Friendship IRL podcast, it is likely that you are doing that. She also mentioned being more consistent with just small check-ins. Again, something we talk about on here all the time. I also think that there were so many gems in this podcast, like the wheel of choices, or being okay with the fact that your kids may not approach friendship quite the way you do. Maybe you learn from them. But at the end of the day, my real takeaway was just, a similar one to the one I have just in general, which is we need to be talking about friendship and community and connections more openly. We need to be saying our thoughts out loud. We need to be discussing what it looks like and the process and our feelings about it. The fact that sometimes it feels easy and sometimes it feels hard, and what we did to get there. More conversations. That's my takeaway. With that, I'll see you next week. Thank you for listening to this episode of Friendship IRL. I am so honored to have these conversations with you, but don't let the chat die here. Send me a voice message. I created a special website just to chat with you. You can find it at alex.chat. You can also find me on Instagram. My handle @itsAlexAlexander, or go ahead and leave a review wherever you prefer to listen to podcasts. Now, if you want to take this conversation a step further, send this episode to a friend. Tell them you found it interesting, and use what we just talked about as a conversation starter the next time you and your friend hang out. No need for a teary goodbye. I'll be back with a new episode next week.